Israel's nightmare is not coming. It is here. And the reason so many people still do not understand that is because they are looking for one dramatic moment, one giant explosion, one single headline that officially announces the collapse. That is not how strategic collapse usually works. It begins when the assumptions stop working. It begins when the shield no longer shields. It begins when the side that was supposed to feel safe starts asking not how to win, but how long it can last. That is where Israel is now. Its air and missile defense is no longer functioning the way the public was promised it would function. That is not a technical footnote. That is the center of the war, because missile defense is not only a military system, it is a psychological system. It tells civilians they are protected. It tells investors the state is stable. It tells allies the war is manageable. It tells enemies that pain can be contained. Once that confidence starts breaking, everything else begins to move with it. And that is exactly what is happening. Now, people still talk as though this war turns on volume alone, as though the old question is still how many missiles Iran can fire. That is already outdated. Iran no longer needs to fire 100 missiles to create the political effect that 10 missiles can create if those 10 missiles are accurate enough, heavy enough, and hard enough to stop. That is what people are missing if the payloads are large, if the targeting is precise, and if the defense on the other side is already strained. Then you do not need spectacle. You need pressure. You need enough successful strikes to make the public understand that the shield is no longer absolute. Once that happens, the war changes shape. It stops being a story about interception percentages. It becomes a story about survival. And the second thing people are still refusing to see is even more dangerous. Large parts of the Iranian missile infrastructure in the east have not been seriously touched at all. Underground facilities remain. Reserve capacity remains. Depth remains. The war most people are watching on television is not the whole war. A large part of the Iranian system that matters most has survived intact. That means time is not automatically working for Israel and the United States. If anything, time is beginning to work against them. Every additional day now carries three costs at once: more military cost, more economic cost, more psychological cost. That is why the language coming out of Washington matters so much. At the beginning, the language was triumphalist: shock, resolve, force, pressure. Now the language is changing. Now you hear talk of declaring victory and leaving. Now you hear talk of stopping this before the economic damage becomes catastrophic. Now you hear, behind the scenes and sometimes in public, the first signs that people close to power are asking the question they never wanted to ask at the beginning: how do we get out? That question appears only when enough people inside the system have already understood that the old fantasy of victory is dying. This war was launched in ignorance and arrogance. Ignorance because Washington and Tel Aviv did not understand Iran. Arrogance because they assumed enough force would produce enough fear, and enough fear would produce submission. But Iran is not a brittle client state. Iran is Persia, a civilizational state with deep memory, deep identity, deep strategic patience, and a political society that may be divided internally on many issues, but will not accept strategic humiliation from outside powers simply because those powers are militarily superior in the short term. That was the first mistake. The second mistake was even more serious. The demands themselves were impossible. Give up enrichment. Give up your ballistic missile force. Stop working with your regional partners. Accept Israeli military and political supremacy in the region. Accept American enforcement of that order. Surrender your sovereignty, surrender your deterrent, and then trust the people threatening you. That was never a realistic negotiating position. It was a surrender document disguised as diplomacy. No serious Iranian government could accept that and survive politically. So the war began from a false assumption. It began from the fantasy that enough military punishment could make Iran accept terms that no serious state would accept voluntarily. That is why the war is now moving toward failure. Not because the United States suddenly lost the ability to hit targets, but because force without a realistic political end state is just a more expensive road to exhaustion. That is what this has become. And once you understand, the economic layer becomes impossible to ignore. For decades, The American imperial system rested on a simple bargain. Gulf oil would be sold in dollars. Those dollars would be recycled into American financial assets, especially U.S. treasuries. That constant global demand for dollars would help sustain the fiscal and military structure of American power. That is the petrodollar system. People talk about it as though it were an abstract finance term. It is not abstract at all. It is one of the hidden foundations of American empire. And what happens if the oil and gas infrastructure of the Gulf is knocked offline, even partially for months? What happens if shipping through the region becomes structurally insecure? What happens if the protector that promised to secure the energy system is exposed as unable to guarantee that promise? Then the question is no longer just whether energy becomes expensive. The deeper question becomes whether the whole credibility of the protection for recycling system starts to erode. That is the real danger. The Gulf monarchies did not spend decades buying protection from Washington because they enjoyed the symbolism of it. They bought protection because they believed it was real. They believed that when things became serious, the American shield would hold, the routes would stay open, the missiles would be intercepted, the deterrent would work. Now they are discovering something much uglier. The missiles still get through. The routes are not secure. The Houthis could not be subdued. Iran cannot be brought to heel. And the very region that was supposed to prove the durability of American protection is now exposing its limits. That changes everything, because once the clients begin to understand that the protector cannot actually protect in the way it promised, the political relationship changes. And once the political relationship changes, the economic relationship changes. And once the economic relationship changes, the petrodollar system itself enters a more fragile phase. That is why this war is much bigger than Israel and Iran. This is not just a question of whether Israel can remain physically intact under missile attack. It is not just a question of whether Trump can find an off-ramp. It is a question about whether the imperial financing model itself is being stressed. And if that model breaks, the consequences will not be regional. They will be global. You can already feel the pressure accumulating. Europe is fragile. Asia is fragile. Debt is enormous. Currencies are fragile. Energy sensitivity is high. So if you add a prolonged Gulf energy shock to that structure, you are not talking about a regional war with bad side effects. You are talking about global recession, perhaps even depression. That is why the pressure inside Washington is changing. At the beginning, it was all confidence. Now the whispers are different. Now the whispers are about exits. That tells you what insiders are seeing. They are finally understanding that this war may continue, but the chance of turning it into a meaningful victory is shrinking. This is where the Iranian strategy has to be understood correctly. Too many people still ask the wrong question. Can Iran beat the United States in a conventional war? That was never the right question. Iran never needed to defeat the United States conventionally. Iran needed to do something much more realistic and much more dangerous. It needed to make American victory politically, economically, and psychologically unaffordable. That is the strategy. And if you look honestly at the war now, you can see that this strategy has been far sharper than most people in Washington wanted to admit. The missile campaign was never only about destruction. It was about exhausting defense stocks. It was about exposing the limits of the shield. It was about showing the Gulf states that the American guarantee is weaker than advertised. It was about showing Washington that escalation produces wider instability faster than political control. That is why deterrence has failed. Deterrence was supposed to prevent this stage from ever arriving. Deterrence was supposed to keep Iran from crossing certain lines. Deterrence was supposed to reassure the Gulf. Deterrence was supposed to make escalation too costly. Instead, the old deterrence story no longer maps onto reality. That is what makes the nightmare real. And then there is the munitions question. This matters more than most commentators want to admit. Yes, the United States still has vast stocks of ordinary munitions, but the war does not turn on ordinary shells. It turns on expensive, specialized systems, advanced interceptors, and the missile defense architecture required to keep a technologically superior military and its allies alive against a serious missile power. Those stocks are not infinite, and the production base behind them is not configured for a long industrial war. That is another truth people still resist. America has organized itself for short wars of punishment. It has not organized itself for prolonged industrial missile wars against resilient regional powers. Iran understands this. Russia understands this. China certainly understands this. And that is why the production question matters so much. The side that can regenerate enough pain faster than the other side can regenerate enough protection gains an advantage over time. That is how long wars are decided, not by television graphics, by endurance, by production, by patience, by political will. This is why the comparison to the Houthis matters. If Washington could not suppress a much weaker actor in Yemen, why did it assume it could compel a civilizational state of more than 90 million people to surrender? That was never analysis. That was fantasy. And fantasy survives the first week of war much better than it survives the second month. Now let us talk about regime change, because that fantasy is still floating around too. This war has actually made regime change less likely in the short term, not more. This is one of the oldest strategic mistakes in history. If you want internal change inside a rival state, direct military assault is often the best way to delay it. Why? Because bombing produces nationalism. It forces cohesion. It makes internal critics into patriots. It turns argument into survival. That is exactly what has happened here. Whatever differences existed inside Iran, the war compressed them into resistance. So not only has regime change failed, the war itself made regime change harder. That is another sign of strategic failure. And it is why any eventual settlement, if there is one, is likely to be humiliating for Washington. Not humiliating in the theatrical sense. Not because Iranian troops march into American territory. Humiliation for an empire looks different. It looks like descending from maximal demands to minimal exit terms. It looks like going from "you must surrender everything" to "how do we stop this before it gets worse?" That is what humiliation looks like for a superpower. Not a dramatic collapse, a narrowing of options, a forced climb down, a strategic contraction. There is always one darker possibility. Israel has nuclear weapons. If Netanyahu reaches the point where conventional means no longer looks sufficient and time no longer looks survivable. The temptation to consider taboo, breaking escalation can rise. I do not say this lightly, and I do not say it because I think it happens tomorrow morning. I say it because once conventional deterrence fails and political endings disappear, decision makers begin staring at doors they would once have called if that door were open, the consequences would be world, historical, not regional world, historical, because many powers on earth would not tolerate the normalization of nuclear use in this conflict. That is why this war now lives inside a much more dangerous zone than most commentary is willing to admit. And that is also why Trump's problem is so severe. I believe Trump wants out. I think he now understands there is nothing meaningful left to win. But wanting out and being able to get out are not the same thing. How does he disengage when Israel is deteriorating? How does he disengage when Congress has been politically and financially aligned for years with maximalist Israeli demands? How does he disengage after using language so absolute that any retreat now looks like weakness? That is the trap. He wants an off-ramp. But the political structure around him punishes realism. That is why I think the next stage will be one of frantic private mediation. Someone somewhere will have to help Washington climb down. Not because America wants dignity, because America needs escape. And the terms of that escape are likely to be much smaller, harsher, and more humiliating than anyone in Washington wants to admit right now. So where does this go? Look at the structure. No realistic end state, no credible path to regime change, no clean ground option, missile defenses degrading, munitions stress rising, energy shock deepening, petrodollar credibility weakening, allied confidence fraying, domestic political will eroding. That is not the beginning of victory. That is the anatomy of imperial retreat. And that is why the real question now is not whether Israel can win. The real question is how much more pressure the system can absorb before the illusion finally breaks. Because once the illusion breaks, events move very fast. And if you want the whole story compressed into one line, it is this. The nightmare is not that Israel and the United States were hit harder than expected. The nightmare is that they are finally discovering the war they chose cannot produce the future they demanded. And once a war reaches that point, the ending may still take time, but it is already written inside the structure.